Workers of the world, listen closely, for the truth you have been denied is the truth that can set history on fire. You are told that your anger is a flaw, a disorder, a sign of personal failure. But I tell you this, your anger is not a burden. It is evidence that you still possess the one thing capitalism has not yet stolen: your ability to feel injustice. Your anger is the last honest emotion in a world built on deceit, and it is precisely the emotion capable of building revolution. Look around you. Every institution that claims to protect you instead protects the wealth of those who exploit you. Every law that pretends to guarantee equality quietly reinforces the hierarchy. That keeps the ruling class above and the working class below. What appears as the natural order of society is nothing more than a long historical construction, brick by brick, generation by generation, built on expropriated labor, stolen time, and wasted human potential. The bourgeoisie calls this stability. I call it the organized theft of life. Your anger stems not from misunderstanding, but from clarity. You see, consciously or unconsciously, that the entire economic system is designed so that the workers produce everything yet possess nothing. Capital grows while human beings shrink. The machines you operate, the buildings you construct, the cities you keep alive, none of them return to you the value you create. And when you demand even a fraction of what you deserve, the capitalist responds not with reason but with repression. Do not let them convince you that your suffering is individual. It is structural. It is historical. It is the unavoidable consequence of a system that transforms human beings into instruments for profit. Capitalism survives by isolating you, by convincing you that your struggle is personal failure rather than collective exploitation. But every injustice you face, low wages, long hours, rising prices, insecure futures, is shared by millions across the world. And what is shared becomes a foundation for unity. Unity becomes organization. Organization becomes power. Power becomes revolutionary change. The ruling class fears this sequence more than anything. They cannot sleep when workers begin to talk. They tremble when workers begin to understand. And they panic when workers begin to organize, because they know that the moment you recognize yourselves as the force that moves history, the illusion of their superiority collapses. They possess wealth, yes, but you possess number, labor, and necessity. Without the workers, capital is nothing but idle metal and worthless paper. But anger alone is not enough. Anger without direction burns out. Anger without organization is easily contained. The history of every revolution teaches us that rebellion becomes transformation only when the working class unites with clear purpose, disciplined consciousness, and collective strength. You must turn your anger outward, not against each other, not against those who share your condition, but against the system that manufactures your misery. Transform your fury into strategy, your suffering into solidarity, your isolation into organization. Study the machinery of society as relentlessly as you study your own wounds. Understand how value is created, how power is hoarded, how ideology is produced to keep you obedient. When you comprehend the mechanisms of exploitation, your anger becomes not merely emotional but scientific. And scientific anger rooted in analysis is unstoppable, because it no longer seeks relief but revolution. The task before you is not small. It is nothing less than the transformation of society itself. But history has shown again and again that when the oppressed discover their collective strength, the seemingly permanent structures of domination crumble in an instant. The walls of power fall not because they are weak, but because the people finally push together. So I say to you today, do not suppress your anger. Sharpen it. Do not apologize for it. Organize it. Your anger is the evidence of your refusal to accept injustice as destiny. It is the spark capable of igniting the will of millions. Let it propel you toward struggle, toward consciousness, toward collective action. Let it drive you to build the movement that will finally put an end to exploitation. For revolutions are not born from calm acceptance. They are born from the fire of those who have suffered too long. And if you dare to turn your anger into action, into unity, into organized power, then you will not simply protest the world as it is, you will change it. Workers, rise. History is waiting for you to claim it. Anger is a revolutionary force, not a personal flaw, because it emerges from the lived reality of exploitation rather than from any weakness within the individual. And to understand this is to recognize anger as a sign of clarity rather than disorder. In capitalist society, people are constantly encouraged to internalize their suffering, to believe that frustration, exhaustion, and despair are personal shortcomings that can be fixed by greater effort, improved attitude, or private self-discipline. But this narrative exists only to divert attention away from the structural forces that produce such emotions in the first place. Anger, therefore, is not a psychological malfunction, but a logical response to conditions. Where human labor is extracted for profit, where time is consumed without adequate compensation, where dignity is traded for survival, and where the working majority is left to navigate a world shaped by the priorities of a wealthy minority. The ruling class has always feared anger because it exposes the contradictions they try to conceal. When workers feel rage, it is because they recognize consciously or instinctively that the world they sustain with their labor denies them control over their own lives. This recognition is the seed of revolutionary consciousness, the moment when emotions that have long been suppressed begin to align with the reality of economic exploitation. Those in power attempt to suppress this anger by turning it inward, encouraging people to blame themselves rather than the system. They promote the idea that success is purely individual and failure is personal, that if you are tired, poor, overworked, or anxious, the fault lies in your lack of discipline or ambition rather than in the structure of society itself. This ideological manipulation is essential for maintaining the capitalist order for a population that turns its anger against itself will never turn it against the conditions that produce it. Yet anger persists because no amount of self-blame can conceal the lived contradictions of daily life. A worker knows the truth in their bones when they put in long hours and still struggle to meet basic needs. A family feels the injustice when their rent rises while their wages stagnate. A community understands exploitation when its labor enriches others while its own streets crumble. Anger gathers in these experiences because the human spirit recognizes exploitation even when ideology tries to hide it. When anger is understood collectively rather than individually, its revolutionary potential becomes undeniable. The moment one sees that their suffering is shared, that their frustration echoes in thousands of other lives, anger transforms from isolated emotion into collective energy. It becomes a unifying force capable of forging solidarity among those who have been divided by design. Capitalism thrives on division between worker and worker, community, nation and nation, because division weakens resistance. But anger, when recognized as a shared response to exploitation, becomes the foundation of unity. It allows people to see that their grievances are not random misfortunes but predictable outcomes of a system organized around profit rather than human need. In this way, anger becomes not only an emotional reaction but a political awakening, a spark that pushes people to question, analyze, and eventually resist the forces that constrain their lives. Revolutionary movements throughout history have been fueled by this collective anger. Not blind rage, but anger sharpened by understanding and directed by purpose. When anger is left to burn undirected, it can be manipulated, scattered, or extinguished. But when anger is connected to analysis, to the study of how power operates and how exploitation persists, it becomes a disciplined force capable of transforming society. This is why anger carries such threat for the ruling class, not because it is chaotic, but because it carries within it the possibility of organized resistance. A worker who is angry but confused is manageable. A worker who is angry and aware is dangerous to the existing order. A class that understands the source of its anger becomes a class capable of challenging the structures that produce it. To reclaim anger as a revolutionary force is to reclaim human dignity. It is to refuse the narrative that suffering is normal, that exploitation is unavoidable, that inequality is natural. It is to insist that the world can be different and that those who labor have the right to shape it. Anger, when recognized in its true form, is not a symptom of failure, but a sign of awakening, the emotional foundation upon which revolutionary consciousness is built. And when people cease to apologize for their anger, and instead understand it as evidence of their humanity, they open the door to collective transformation, to the possibility of a world shaped by those who produce its wealth rather than those who hoard it. Capitalism survives by exploiting workers and masking inequality as natural because the system depends on a continuous extraction of labor from the many to support the comfort and power of the few, and it can only maintain this arrangement by convincing people that such inequality is inevitable, rational, or even just. From the moment a worker enters the labor market, they are positioned not as a human being with needs, desires, and dignity, but as a commodity, something to be bought, used, and discarded according to the demands of profit. This transformation of people into labor units is the core engine of capitalist production. It is not innovation or entrepreneurship that sustains the system, but the ongoing appropriation of the difference between what workers produce and what they receive. This unpaid portion of labor, the surplus value, is the source of the capitalist's wealth. Yet this fundamental exploitation must be hidden behind layers of ideology, myth, and manufactured common sense, for no system can endure if it openly admits that its prosperity is built upon the systematic extraction of life from the majority. To mask this inequality as natural, capitalism constructs an elaborate narrative about merit, competition, and personal responsibility. It claims that anyone can succeed through hard work and discipline, that wealth flows to those who deserve it, and that poverty is the result of laziness or poor choices. These ideas function as ideological shields, designed not to describe reality but to justify exploitation. They erase the structural forces that trap millions in low-wage labor, deny access to resources, and centralize wealth in the hands of a few who do not labor at all. The myth of the self-made capitalist is necessary because the truth that wealth is accumulated through the labor of others would expose the moral and economic contradictions at the center of the system. So inequality is presented as a natural consequence of differences in ability or ambition, rather than as a deliberate outcome of a system built to funnel value upward. Capitalism also normalizes inequality through its institutions and cultural practices. Schools teach children to obey authority and compete against one another rather than cooperate. Workplaces train people to accept hierarchy as normal, to submit to the decisions of managers and owners without questioning why those who labor the least earn the most. Media glorifies wealth as the highest measure of success, while blaming individuals for their economic struggles. Even religious and moral frameworks are often shaped to portray suffering as noble or inevitable, encouraging resignation instead of resistance. All of this creates a worldview in which inequality appears not only natural but unavoidable, as if it reflects the very order of the universe rather than the choices of those who benefit from it. But exploitation is not hidden because it is subtle. It is hidden because people are taught to look away from it. The worker who produces immense value may never see the profits generated from their labor. Their wage appears as a complete payment, obscuring the fact that they create far more than they receive. This wage illusion is one of capitalism's most powerful tools. By paying workers only a portion of what they produce, the capitalist extracts value without appearing to steal. The process is masked in contracts, economic jargon, and the daily routines of labor. Yet the reality remains: the wealth of the ruling class is built upon the unpaid labor of the working class, and this fundamental injustice is the foundation of the system. Capitalism must also conceal the instability it creates. Economic crisis, unemployment, inflation, and poverty are presented as natural cycles rather than consequences of a system driven by profit rather than need. When workers lose their jobs, they are told to retrain, adapt, or work harder. When prices rise, they are told it is the invisible hand of the market. When corporations lay off thousands while reporting record profits, the system claims it is simply responding to efficiency. These explanations serve to individualize problems that are collective and systemic, shifting responsibility from the structure of capitalism onto the people it harms. The greatest danger to capitalism is a working class that recognizes exploitation as a shared condition. This is why the system works tirelessly to isolate individuals, turning every economic struggle into a private battle. But once the worker understands that their suffering is not a personal defect, but a deliberate consequence of capitalist production, the mask falls. Inequality is revealed not as natural but as engineered. Exploitation becomes visible not as necessity but as theft. And with this clarity, the possibility of resistance emerges, for no system can endure when its victims understand its mechanisms and unite to challenge its foundation. Workers create all value yet remain dispossessed of power and wealth because the structure of capitalist society is designed so that those who produce the necessities of life, food, housing, transportation, technology, and every material good are systematically separated from the fruits of their own labor. The worker enters the workplace with only one thing to sell: their labor power, the capacity of their body and mind to produce value. The capitalist owns the tools, machines, and facilities required for production, not because they built them, but because private property laws allow them to monopolize the means of production. From the moment the worker begins their day, they create value that exceeds the wage they will receive. This difference, the surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist who profits not from their own labor, but from the unpaid labor of others. Thus the worker, who is the true engine of all production, walks away with only enough to survive, while the capitalist accumulates wealth without contributing to the creation of that wealth. This dispossession is not accidental or temporary. It is central to the functioning of the capitalist system. If workers were to receive the full value of what they create, profit would cease to exist, and the entire system built around accumulation would collapse. Capitalism, therefore, requires that workers remain permanently separated from the means by which they produce value. In every factory, office, farm, warehouse, or digital workplace, the same contradiction unfolds. The worker gives life to the system, but the system denies the worker any control over the conditions of their labor or the products they generate. Even the tools and machines workers use, often invented, refined, or improved by workers themselves, become instruments of their own subordination, owned by those who never touch them but profit from their operation. This dispossession extends beyond the workplace into the realm of political power. The same class that controls economic production also shapes laws, policies, and institutions to protect their interests. Parliaments, courts, and regulatory bodies often present themselves as neutral, but their actions consistently reflect the priorities of those who hold wealth. Workers, despite being the majority, find their voices diluted, their demands ignored, and their participation reduced to occasional voting in systems that rarely challenge the foundations of capitalist ownership. Economic inequality transforms into political inequality, ensuring that those who create value remain excluded from decision-making over how society's wealth is distributed and used. Even culturally and ideologically, workers are dispossessed of recognition. The prestige and honor of society are often assigned to those who accumulate wealth rather than those who create it. The billionaire is celebrated as a visionary, the CEO as a genius, the landlord as a pillar of society, while the worker who builds the roads, staffs the hospitals, teaches the children, or maintains the power grid remains invisible. This ideological inversion is necessary to maintain the illusion that wealth is created by capital rather than labor. In reality, no corporation, factory, or institution can function without workers, yet workers are led to believe that their survival depends on the goodwill of the capitalist. Dispossession also takes the form of instability and insecurity. The worker's income is never guaranteed because their livelihood depends on whether a capitalist finds it profitable to employ them. Technological innovations, economic crises, and corporate restructuring often result in workers losing jobs. Yet the wealth generated by past labor remains firmly in the hands of the owners. Even automation, which should liberate workers from toil, becomes another method of dispossession, increasing productivity while reducing employment and strengthening the power of capital over labor. The workers' contributions build the world, yet they are continually pushed into precarity while the benefits of their productivity flow upward. What workers create is not only economic value, but also the very social relations that make collective life possible. They build communities, sustain families, uphold public institutions, and maintain the infrastructure of society. Yet even in these spheres, they remain denied control. Decisions about urban planning, education, healthcare, and transportation are made by those with wealth or political influence, not by the people who rely on and sustain these systems. Thus workers, who are the foundation of society, are alienated from every sphere of power, economic, political and social, while their labor continues to generate the wealth that sustains the ruling class. This contradiction, workers generating all value while being denied power, is the engine of class struggle. The system cannot hide the reality that without workers, everything stops. When workers withdraw their labor, production halts, profits vanish, and the true dependency of the ruling class becomes visible. The power of workers lies not only in numbers, but in their indispensable role in every aspect of production. To recognize this is to understand that dispossession is not destiny, but a condition that can be overturned through collective organization, class consciousness, and the struggle to reclaim the power and wealth that rightfully belong to those who create them. Collective unity and organization are the ruling class's greatest fear, because they expose the fragile foundation upon which the power of the elite truly rests. The ruling class appears dominant only when workers remain isolated, fragmented, and unaware of their shared condition. As long as people see their struggles as individual burdens rather than collective consequence of the economic system, the ruling class can maintain its control with minimal force. But the moment workers recognize that their suffering is neither natural nor personal, but structural and shared, the illusion of capitalist stability begins to fracture. Unity transforms millions of isolated grievances into a single, coherent force capable of challenging the system at its roots. This is why every effort is made to prevent workers from organizing for organization, is the process by which raw discontent becomes political power. Throughout history, the ruling class has understood better than anyone that their dominance depends not on their strength but on the weakness of the majority. They know they are outnumbered. They know they do not labor, produce, or sustain society. They merely profit from those who do. This vulnerable position forces them to deploy a wide array of strategies to keep workers divided: economic competition, racial and ethnic antagonisms, gender hierarchies, nationalist sentiments, and the glorification of individual success. These divisions are not accidents but intentional tools used to ensure that workers never see themselves as part of a unified class with shared interests. When workers are separated, their anger dissipates in countless directions. But when they unite, anger becomes focused, strategic, and capable of reshaping society. Organization is feared because it transforms the working class from a scattered population into a disciplined social force. An isolated worker can be ignored, silenced, or replaced. An organized workforce cannot. A lone protest can be dismissed. A general strike can shut down the engines of capital. The ruling class depends on the uninterrupted flow of labor, and organization threatens this flow at its core. When workers coordinate their actions, when they build unions, councils, committees, or movements rooted in solidarity, they acquire the ability to halt production, disrupt profit, and force concessions from those who claim to own the resources of society. This ability terrifies the ruling class because it reveals where true power resides not in capital itself, but in the labor that animates it. The ruling class, therefore, expends immense resources on suppressing unity and discrediting organization. They control media narratives that portray collective action as dangerous, irrational, or harmful to the economy. They fund political parties and institutions that weaken labor rights, restrict unionization, and promote policies designed to keep workers insecure. They use the law to criminalize dissent while simultaneously presenting themselves as benevolent protectors of order. Their fear becomes visible through their hostility toward any form of worker cooperation. Even small acts of solidarity, sharing grievances, forming committees, discussing wages, are perceived as threats, for they represent the early stages of organization. Yet the greatest fear of the ruling class is not merely a united workforce, but a consciously united one. Organization without class consciousness can fade, fracture, or be co-opted. But when workers understand the nature of exploitation, the mechanics of capital, and the historical role of their class, unity becomes unbreakable. Conscious unity cannot be bribed, distracted, or easily dismantled. It becomes revolutionary. It seeks not just better conditions within the system, but the transformation of the system itself. This kind of unity challenges not only the ruling class's wealth but their legitimacy, revealing that their authority is neither natural nor earned, but imposed. The ruling class fears unity because it overturns the narrative that they are indispensable. The moment workers act together, they demonstrate that society runs because of their labor, not because of the capitalist's ownership. The machines, technology, infrastructure, and institutions that appear to belong to the ruling class are meaningless without workers to operate them. When workers recognize this, they cease to see themselves as powerless and begin to recognize their collective strength. The ruling class fears this recognition more than anything, for it signals the possibility of a world organized around human need rather than profit. Collective unity and organization represent the awakening of the working class to its historical role. They point toward the end of passive endurance and the beginning of active struggle. They transform individuals into a class, grievances into demands, and demands into movements capable of reshaping society. The ruling class fears unity because it reveals the truth that their power is not permanent, not natural, and not invulnerable. It survives only as long as workers remain divided. But once the masses unite, organized and conscious, the foundations of the ruling class tremble, and the possibility of liberation emerges with unstoppable force. Revolution emerges when anger is transformed into conscious, organized action, because anger in its raw form is merely an emotional spark, a sign that people recognize injustice but have not yet developed the means to challenge it. Anger alone can erupt powerfully, but without direction, it fades quickly or gets redirected by the very forces that created it. Capitalism has survived countless waves of spontaneous anger because the ruling class understands that unorganized rage burns out fast, dissipates without strategic focus, and often isolates individuals rather than uniting them. But when anger is shaped by clarity, discipline, and collective purpose, it becomes something entirely different. It becomes a force that can alter the foundations of society. Consciousness gives anger context, helping people see not only what they feel, but why they feel it, and who benefits from their suffering. Organization gives anger structure, transforming isolated frustration into coordinated struggle capable of confronting the institutions of power. To transform anger into revolutionary energy, people must first recognize that their emotions stem from systemic forces rather than personal failure. This recognition is the beginning of consciousness. When workers understand that their exhaustion, anxiety, and despair are not individual flaws, but products of an economic order built on exploitation, their anger becomes political. It moves beyond mere dissatisfaction and becomes a form of awareness, a refusal to accept the conditions imposed upon them. This is why consciousness is so dangerous to the ruling class. It exposes the mechanisms of exploitation that capitalism tries to hide. Anger that is conscious no longer lashes blindly, but targets the structures and institutions responsible for inequality. It becomes analytical, purposeful, and impossible to dismiss as irrational or impulsive. Yet consciousness alone is insufficient without organization. The ruling class is always better equipped, better resourced, and more unified than any isolated group of workers. Capitalist institutions, from parliaments to police forces to media outlets, are structured to protect the interests of those who hold power. No amount of individual anger, no matter how intense, can dismantle such entrenched systems. But when workers organize, they create a counterforce, one rooted in numbers, solidarity, and collective strength. Organization consolidates anger into strategic action, turning the scattered frustrations of millions into a unified movement. Through organization, workers develop the tools necessary for sustained struggle, communication networks, decision-making bodies, strike structures, community alliances, and forms of resistance that cannot be easily crushed. The process of organizing anger is also the process of transforming people. Individuals who felt powerless discover their strength when they join others who share their condition. Fear diminishes when people realize they are not alone. Actions that seemed impossible, strikes, occupations, confrontation with authority, become achievable when carried out collectively. Anger gives the initial push, But organization provides the means to continue moving even when the enemy retaliates. It allows movements to adapt, grow, and build momentum over time rather than collapsing under pressure. The ruling class relies on fatigue, confusion, and division to weaken resistance. And organization counters each of these by offering endurance, clarity, and unity. Revolution emerges not from anger as an impulse, but from anger as a conscious project. It becomes a disciplined force when guided by clear principles, collective goals, and strategic planning. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means harnessing emotion as fuel for action. The greatest revolutionary moments in history were not explosions of chaos but coordinate upheavals driven by people who transformed their suffering into determination. They understood that the system they opposed would not collapse under moral outrage alone. It would collapse only when met with organized resistance capable of interrupting its operations, challenging its legitimacy, and building alternative structures rooted in equality and collective ownership. Organized anger has another powerful effect. It creates solidarity across differences that capitalism uses to divide people. Workers who might have been separated by race, gender, nationality, or religion discover their shared exploitation and common enemy. This unifying force turns anger outward against the system rather than inward against one another. It sharpens class consciousness and dissolves the illusions that the ruling class relies upon to maintain control. When workers understand their shared struggle, their anger becomes a bond that strengthens their resolve and their willingness to fight for one another. A revolution is not a moment but a movement, and anger transformed into conscious, organized action is what sustains that movement. It is the pathway from grievance to transformation, from passive suffering to active resistance. It is the emotional and intellectual engine that propels the working class from understanding exploitation to challenging it. When anger gains clarity and finds structure within organized struggle, it no longer seeks temporary relief but envisions a different world entirely. And it is in this transformation from emotion to awareness, from awareness to organization, that the possibility of revolution truly begins. In the end, every truth revealed in this speech points to a single, unavoidable reality. The power to transform society has always belonged to those who labor, not those who profit from that labor. Anger, exploitation, inequality, and division are not isolated experiences but interconnected. Weapons used to suppress the immense potential of the working class. Yet these same forces contain within them the seeds of liberation. The anger workers feel is not a sign of weakness but evidence of a collective awakening. The exploitation they endure exposes the true nature of capitalism and the illegitimacy of the ruling class. The inequality they witness daily is not a natural order, but a manufactured hierarchy designed to keep them in place. And the divisions that separate them lose their power the moment workers recognize their shared struggle and unite. A revolution does not begin when conditions worsen. It begins when people refuse to accept those conditions as permanent. It begins when anger becomes understanding, when understanding becomes organization, and when organization becomes action. This is the moment when workers cease to see themselves as isolated individuals, and instead recognize themselves as a class with the power to shape history. If the ruling class fears anything, it is this realization, because it marks the end of their dominance, and the beginning of a new world built on equality, cooperation, and collective ownership. The future belongs to those who create it. And when workers rise with clarity, unity, and purpose, nothing can stand in their way.